You have seen this image 1,000 times. A long black robe almost touching the ground, a wide-brimmed leather hat, gloves up to the elbow, and the mask. The mask with the impossible beak stretching out from the face like the head of some great dark bird with glass discs for eyes. It is one of the most recognizable costumes in human history. It appears in horror films, video games, Halloween parties, and tourist shops in Venice. It has become a global symbol of plague, of death, and of the strange medical traditions of the past. Almost everything you assume about the men who wore it is wrong. The men inside those masks were rarely doctors. Most of them had no medical training. The treatments they administered were, in many cases, more dangerous than the disease itself. And in the cities where they were hired, the death rates were so high that the men inside the costumes died at twice the rate of the patients they were supposed to be treating. This is the part of the plague doctor story that nobody tells you. To understand why grown men ended up walking the streets of plague-ridden cities dressed like nightmare birds, we have to start with the disease itself, because the Black Death was not just a pandemic. It was the closest the human species has ever come to ending. Between 1346 and 1353, the Black Death killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people. Estimates vary because the record-keeping in 14th century Europe was, for obvious reasons, not at its best. The lower estimate represents about 30% of the population of Europe. The upper estimate is closer to 60%. For comparison, the deadliest war in human history, World War II, killed approximately 3% of the global population. The 1918 influenza pandemic killed approximately 2%. The Black Death killed roughly half of everyone alive in its path. The disease itself was caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, transmitted by fleas that lived on rats. We know this now. They did not know this then. What they saw was something more terrifying. Healthy people would wake up with a small lump in their armpit or groin. Within hours, the lump would swell to the size of an apple. The skin around it would turn black. The patient would develop a fever, then begin coughing up blood, then die. Most victims died within 3 days of showing the first symptom. Whole villages emptied. In Florence, contemporary chronicler Boccaccio wrote that bodies were stacked in the streets faster than carts could remove them. In London, mass graves were dug and filled with hundreds of corpses at a time. In some cities, more than half the population died. And here is the detail that explains everything else in this story. When the plague came, the doctors fled. This is not a metaphor. The actual physicians of medieval Europe, the trained men with university degrees from Bologna and Paris, packed their bags and left. They left in caravans. They left in ships. They left in the night. The wealthier the doctor, the further he ran. Some retired to country estates and waited for the plague to burn itself out. Others left their cities entirely and moved to plague-free regions, where they continued to charge enormous fees for treating non-plague illnesses while their hometowns died. This was, in some ways, rational. A doctor who stayed and treated plague patients had a better than even chance of dying himself. Medical knowledge of contagion was minimal. The few protective measures available were almost useless. The doctors who fled lived. The doctors who stayed mostly did not. But this created a crisis for the cities, because the city still had thousands of dying citizens. The civic authorities, the mayors, and councils and magistrates of plague-stricken European towns had to do something, or appear to be doing something. The political pressure was immense. People wanted doctors. Cities had no doctors. So they hired the next available men. This is the moment the plague doctor was born, not as a medical institution, but as a desperate civic response. City councils began contracting men to walk the streets, visit plague households, and perform the rituals that looked like medicine. They paid them generously. The salary of a city plague doctor in 17th century France was roughly 4 times that of a normal physician. And the men who took the job were almost never trained physicians. They were second-tier surgeons, the kind who had spent their careers performing amputations and tooth extractions. They were retired barbers who had handled minor surgeries as part of their trade. They were apothecaries, mixers of herbs and tonics. They were, in some documented cases, men who had no medical background at all. Just men who needed money and were willing to die for it. A French historian who studied the plague doctor contracts of 16th century Paris found one document where a city had hired a man whose previous employment was listed as fishmonger. The fishmonger was given a uniform, a salary, and a list of plague households to visit. He was, for the next 4 months of his life, a doctor. He did not last 4 months. The records do not say what killed him. Now we come to the costume. The bird mask uniform that has become the symbol of all plague doctors is, in fact, a relatively late invention. It was designed in 1619 by a French physician named Charles Delorme, who served as the personal doctor of King Louis XIII. The plague had returned to Paris, and Delorme proposed a protective uniform that would shield the wearer from what was then believed to be the cause of the disease. That cause was bad air. The dominant medical theory of the time was called miasma. The idea was that disease spread through invisible, foul-smelling vapors that rose from rotting matter, swamps, corpses, and stagnant water. Doctors believed that if they could prevent themselves from breathing in this bad air, they could avoid catching the plague. They were wrong about the cause. They were right about the avoidance. Delorme's uniform was designed entirely around blocking miasma. The robe was made of waxed leather, treated with animal fat to create a seal against the air. The hat was wide-brimmed to keep falling miasma off the face. The gloves extended to the elbow and were tied tight at the openings. And the beak. The beak was the centerpiece of the costume, and it had a specific function that almost nobody talks about. The beak was a filtration device. The doctor would stuff the inside of the beak with materials believed to purify the air being breathed. These materials varied, but typical contents included dried roses, carnations, mint leaves, camphor, ambergris, cloves, laudanum, and myrrh. In some recipes, the beak was filled with so much herbal material that the doctor had to inhale through several inches of compressed flowers to draw breath. The result was that plague doctors smelled, at all times, like a walking flower shop on fire. The eye discs of the mask were made from glass and were intended to keep miasma from entering through the eyes, which medieval medicine believed could happen. The total cost of the uniform was significant. A full plague doctor outfit in 1619 Paris was worth approximately a year of a working-class wage. This is one reason the plague doctor uniform spread slowly. Many cities couldn't afford to outfit their own. Some doctors purchased their own uniforms and were reimbursed by the city after the plague was over, if they lived. Now here is the question that defines this entire story. Did the costume actually work? Modern medical historians are divided. The miasma theory was wrong. The plague was not airborne in the bubonic form, which was the most common variant. It was transmitted by fleas. So the air-blocking elements of the costume, the beak full of flowers, the waxed leather seal, the eye discs, were all targeting a transmission method that did not exist. But the costume had one accidental benefit. It was almost completely flea-proof. The waxed leather robe, the gloves tied tight at the wrist, the wide-brimmed hat that kept fleas from jumping onto the head, the high boots. All of these created a physical barrier that fleas could not penetrate. A doctor in the bird mask costume was, by accident, wearing one of the most effective anti-flea suits ever designed. Some plague doctors did in fact survive. The records of 17th century French and Italian plague doctors show that those who wore the full Delorme costume had measurably lower death rates than the doctors who wore normal clothes. They thought it was the flowers in the beak. it was actually the leather sealing them off from the rats. Not all plague doctors wore this costume. The bird mask is the version that has come down to us in popular culture, but for most of the plague centuries, doctors wore whatever they had: a long coat, a scarf wrapped around the face, a makeshift mask of cloth. And the treatments they administered, costume or not, were almost universally useless, sometimes worse than useless. The most common treatment was bloodletting. The theory was that the plague produced bad blood and that draining some of it would help the patient recover. In practice, bloodletting weakened already dying patients and accelerated their deaths. The second most common treatment was lancing the buboes. The buboes, those swollen lymph nodes the size of apples, were thought to be the focal point of the disease. Plague doctors would slice them open with a scalpel and drain them, sometimes packing them with herbs or honey. The procedure was excruciating. It also occasionally caused the disease to spread further into the patient's bloodstream, killing them faster. The third most common treatment was the application of a mixture called theriac. Theriac was an ancient compound dating back to Roman Emperor Mithridates VI that contained between 30 and 80 ingredients, depending on the recipe. These ingredients ranged from the merely strange, like roasted cinnamon and ground pearls, to the actively dangerous, like opium, mercury, and powdered viper flesh. Plague doctors would mix theriac into a paste and apply it to the patient's skin, or, in some cases, force the patient to drink it. Theriac was, in many cases, the actual cause of death. And a fourth treatment, perhaps the most disturbing, was the application of dead toads to the patient's chest. The theory was that the toads would absorb the disease through some sympathetic mechanism. The reality was that the toads simply rotted on top of patients who were already dying. Plague doctors carried walking sticks, sometimes as long as 4 feet, which they used to prod patients without touching them. Some used these sticks to lift bedclothes and examine buboes from a distance. Others used them to shoo family members away from the dying. In rare cases, the sticks were used to administer the last rites, with the doctor pointing at a religious symbol from across the room. The doctor was not present for healing. The doctor was present so that the city could record that a doctor had been there. And here is where the story turns dark. Plague doctors died at extraordinary rates. The most cited estimate, drawn from records in Venice and Paris in the 17th century, suggests that plague doctors had a mortality rate of around 60% during active plague outbreaks. This is roughly twice the death rate of the general population in the same cities. The reasons are complex. Plague doctors entered plague households many times per day. They handled bodies. They were often given the lowest quality food and shelter. They were sometimes quarantined separately from their families and forbidden from leaving the city. When a plague doctor died, the contract usually included a clause that his family would receive a payment. The payment was typically equal to 1 month of his salary. Multiple cities also had clauses that, if the plague doctor abandoned his post, his family would forfeit any back wages owed and would be barred from the city. Many plague doctors were, in effect, indentured. The Venetian records contain one particularly grim detail. The contract for plague doctors in Venice in 1576 stipulated that the doctor must remain in the plague quarantine district for the duration of the outbreak. He was given a small house, the costume, a salary, and a designated graveyard. The graveyard was for him. Some plague doctors were heroes, some were quacks. Some were, by the standards of their era, doing their best. The Italian physician Cosimo Maccarino kept a journal during the Florence plague of 1633, in which he described visiting hundreds of dying patients, returning home each night to wash his clothes in vinegar, and praying that the costume he had purchased with his own savings would protect him. He survived. His journal survives. It is one of the few first-person accounts of a plague doctor's daily life that we have. Many others were exploitative. There are documented cases of plague doctors who used their position to enter the homes of dying wealthy families and steal valuables, knowing that the patients were too weak to stop them. Others charged fees for private treatments they were already being paid by the city to administer. A French plague doctor named Henri Goyon was hanged in Lyon in 1628 for forging plague death certificates so that families could claim insurance payments earlier. The plague doctor was, in other words, a complicated figure, not the heroic medical pioneer of popular memory, not the cackling fraud of horror movies, something in between. A man in a costume that looked like it was protecting him, pretending to administer medicine that he half believed in a society that was ending around him. And then the costume began to outlive the doctor. By the 18th century, the major European plague outbreaks had ended. The bird mask uniform, which had once been a working medical garment, became something else. It became a symbol. It appeared in Italian commedia dell'arte, in Venetian carnival masks, in tarot decks, and eventually in horror fiction. By the 21st century, the plague doctor had become one of the most popular Halloween costumes in the world. Tourists buy plastic versions of the bird mask in Venice for €30. Video games feature them as villains. Horror movies use them as visual shorthand for ancient evil. The image has been almost completely separated from its original meaning. The men who wore the costume were not magicians. They were not killers. They were not brave servants of medicine. They were, in most cases, frightened civilians in a fancy uniform, hired by their cities because the actual doctors had run away. They were the second-tier replacement when the plague came. They were paid extra because the job was likely to kill them. Most of them were illiterate. Many of them died with the job. The names of the great majority of plague doctors who ever lived have been lost. The mask survived. The men inside it did not. That is the part of the plague doctor story they don't put on the costume packaging. And it brings up a question that has bothered medical historians for centuries. If the actual doctors of medieval Europe ran when the plague came, what does that tell us about how a society responds to a real catastrophe? What does it say about who shows up and who doesn't? Modern epidemics have given us partial answers. Doctors and nurses during recent outbreaks did not run. Most of them stayed. Some of them died. The plague doctor story is, in part, the story of a profession that has changed. The medical ethic of do no harm and stay was not as universal in 1348 as we might wish it had been. What would you have done? If the plague came tomorrow and your trained doctor fled, would you take the fishmonger's job? Would you put on the costume? Would you stay? Tell me in the comments. I want to know. I'm Dark Histories. Thank you for watching.